Hi, today I want to mix things up a little bit for you and actually show you some of the things I'm talking about in the post-processing. So certainly writing about it I think gives you a little bit of background, but actually seeing I think can help you understand in a way that perhaps just my words and screen grabs wouldn't be able to. So first of all, I've talked about Photoshop before, but really that's only one of the two programs that I use. The other one here is called Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. I think Lightroom is such a great program that anybody who enjoys photography can really get some benefit about it. I don't want to go too much into it, but a couple of quick things here. I'm just going to show you the library module and this develop module. So first of all, if you look down here at the bottom, you can see that I've got 130,705 images in this particular library. Now that's a lot of pictures, and you think, oh my god, that's gonna be a really hard thing to sort through, and it is, except that one of the huge things about Lightroom is that it allows you to tag your images. So now for example, if I want to find a picture of Maybe, I can just do a quick search here, type in her name, and now out of all those pictures I only have 5,158 pictures that have her in some form. Now some of them are pretty small, or some of them are mistagged, but you get the idea. It's really easy to narrow things down. The other thing you can do is you can give them obviously colors. You can see some of these are red. You can also give them stars, so 1 through 5, and you can also pick things as flagged as either a pick, a reject, or just unflagged. And so any of these combinations of things can be searched for, including the keywords. You can search for the camera model. So if for example I was shooting with somebody else's camera, or if it was a camera that I used say 10 years ago, then I could quickly find that information. It makes it really, really easy. The next thing is really the develop module, and the key here is to understand that this is kind of where the magic happens. And library module, very important for keeping track of images. Develop module is where you process them. So you think, back in the days of film that we had a darkroom. Think of the develop module here as a digital darkroom. And before we go on here, one more thing that's worth pointing out is that what I have here in Lightroom is actually also built into Photoshop. It has a thing that's called the Adobe Camera Raw module, and it's almost like a separate pop-up program where it allows you to do these same exact things. However, it's not as easy to automate, for one, and it's just this is laid out in a way that's much more natural to most people. So anyways, this is a post really about the JPEG versus RAW format. And as I said in the text, the JPEG, the .jpg or JPEG, depending, file is going to, by your camera, decide things like contrast and saturation and sharpness. And those things are going to be kind of baked into the file. But there's also things like the white balance setting. So have you ever had a picture where you had your camera set for, let's say, outdoor setting, and then you came in at night and you took a picture and it was really orange? Well, you can just go ahead and you can change it. So had this been a JPEG image instead of a RAW, I would have had auto and as shot in custom. But because this is a RAW file, none of that stuff is actually permanently set in the image, so I can go ahead and change it. So if, for example, this was a daylight image, I can change it to daylight. If it was shot under tungsten, you can see. And so it's really easy to change these things, and it's important to note that they're changed in a way that is in no way permanent and in no way destructive to the file. So the JPEG image, you can only kind of twist it and turn it so many ways before essentially it breaks, and you start to see things like funny banding patterns, or you'll see lots of digital noise. The RAW file not only allows you to change these things after the fact, but it also even lets you change the exposure after the fact, which is pretty cool. So if you take a look here, this histogram, And what this is showing you is the luminosity value. So basically how bright something is in the shadows over here on the left, or the highlights over here on the right, and everything of course in between. Now if it's a JPEG, the camera's going to say, okay, this is it. So we're going to press this into it and there's no more information. But because this is a RAW file, I can actually change the exposure up to 5 stops either in either direction. So I can make it much darker, which obviously that's a little too dark for this image. I can make it much brighter, and obviously again way too bright. However, hopefully you can see how that can be really a useful thing. So even if I crank this all the way over to a +5, what do we see here is actually not too bad a detail here in the eye. I mean, it's overexposed. We can see some good detail here under the shadow, and so we can bring it back. So maybe we want the eye to be somewhere plus 2.6 stops or whatever. Obviously this part here is all overexposed, and we can see that if we turn on the overlay, all that white spot is overexposed with lots of detail. Now had this been a JPEG, well, yeah, you can make it brighter, you can make it darker, but if it's already overexposed like this, where we see these red spots, all we can do is bring it back to where it's not pure white. We can make it a really bright gray essentially. But because this is a RAW file, we can actually bring back fur detail. And so if we zoom in here, you can see where it was overexposed. Now we can actually see some texture in the fur, and that's pretty cool. So we're already getting a little long-winded here. I wanted to show you how, in addition to just basically, how cool this is and how many things you can do it, how powerful it is. So you might look at this and you might think, oh, it's a relatively underexposed image. It's not that great. Well, I actually do it this way on purpose. So the idea is to get most of the detail in between the shadow point here and the pure white point here on the histogram. Even though I have this flexibility, keeping everything within there is going to give me the best possible image quality. So had I shot to make this eye brighter, then I probably would have lost a little detail here, even though I've got a lot of flexibility. By going with kind of exposing for the brightest parts without getting them overexposed, it allows me a lot of flexibility in the way I process it. So first I'm going to decide I want to make this into a square format. So I click on the little crop tool. I'm going to do 1 by 1 because we want the sides to be equal. We want it to be basically the height and the width to be the same. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. We can also change the angle here if you decide you don't like it, but I actually like the way it was to begin with, so I'm going to go back to 0. I'm going to go probably something like that. I've talked before about the rule of thirds. You can see I've got one of her eyes on one of these crossing lines. I've also got her nose on one of these crossing lines, and so that's kind of what you look for a rule of thirds. We'll go ahead and click done. So this is the final image I want to do, and you probably weren't paying attention, but the histogram here actually changed because of the way I cropped it. And so basically it's saying, instead of looking at, let's go back to the original, looking at everything, now it's just looking at the parts that I want it to look at. And so the histogram is going to change slightly. It depends on the image, on how much it might change, but it'll give you an idea. So we can exchange the exposure, but this is what I would consider to be a global adjustment. It's changing everything equally in the image, and that's not necessarily the best way to do it, because here, not too bad. We probably want to make it just a little bit brighter. Here we want to make it a lot brighter. Here, this is part of the pad she was laying on, doesn't need to be too bright. So the better tool to use is something that's going to allow you to do local adjustments. So just target where you want. There's a couple of things that we might use here. A graduated filter. So here I'm going to increase the exposure. We'll just say 1 to make it nice and even. And I'm going to make it a little bit more warm. That is a little bit yellower. So I'm just going to click and I'm going to drag this over here. And you can see immediately, just by turning this on and off, how that makes it a little bit nicer. I still like this side here more or less, but I think it could be a little bit brighter. And so I'm going to make another one of those, and I'm going to bring this down because it doesn't need to be nearly so bright. And I'm going to bring that in from this side. And now I'm going to click done here because I think that this is at a good part. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to show you here the before and the after. So even that little bit makes a difference. I'm going to leave it here because I like the way that the background looks, and really it's the face that I want to focus on. So what I want to do next is a radial filter. So that works the exact same way, and you can see it even takes over the same settings from before, but of course it does it more in an elliptical manner. So I could do it as a perfect circle or as an ellipse, and you can kind of see how that works. And I can do it in a way that will allow me to make changes either inside the circle or outside just by clicking on this invert. And you can see how that works, but I want this to be inside. I don't think the shape is here quite perfect, so I can rotate it just a little bit. And so now, you know, the shape of this kind of fits her head a little bit. And I double clicked and I turned that off by mistake. So here I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now one of the things I want you to notice is that I'm starting to get a little bit of clipping here. So remember I said how the red highlights or overlay shows you when it's too exposed? I can just bring this down here, but instead what I want to do is I'm just going to change the highlight portion of it. So I bring those values down without really changing the shadow values. Next I probably want to I probably want to bring up these shadows just a little bit more. So I'm going to bring up the shadows here, and I'm getting a result that I think is pretty good. I might bring it up just a touch more overall, which means I need to bring the highlights down just a little bit more. Maybe not quite that much. Maybe I'll change the contrast just a little bit, and maybe I'll warm that up just a little bit more, because of course anything that's a little bit more towards the yellow reds is what we call warm, whereas the blues and greens are a little cool. Warm tones tend to be thought of as happier kind of colors, and so that's why a little bit warmer. Of course, is a picture of a dog that I love, so I want it to be more of a happy thing. Next, what I'm going to do is work on the adjustment brush. So where the gradient was allowing me to do kind of left to right or top to bottom adjustments, the radial filter was letting me do elliptical sorts of things. The brush tool here is now going to let me paint just in very specific areas, and so hopefully you can see two circles here. I'll bring it over into a little darker area. So the inner circle is where it's going to be applied fully, and the outer circle is where it's going to be applied not at all. And so the area in between it is what we call a feather, and it gives it a much more graduated sort of look. So basically anytime you're doing something, you don't necessarily want an on or an off. You want something that's kind of nice and smooth and feathered. So I'm actually going to feather this just a little bit more and crank that up. Now I'm going to brighten this eye up just a little bit, and I'm going to bring this area down just a little bit. So I'm going to do new over here. I'm going to reduce the exposure value, reduce the highlight value just a little bit, and make my brush a little bit smaller, and then just go ahead and paint that in. So now we're going to say done. We're going to look at the overall picture, maybe just bring up the shadows just a little bit more. Clarity is going to make things seem a little bit sharper, so a little bit more in focus, and so you can kind of see how that looks on, or it's going to make it look blurry. Obviously, when you go to either extremes, that's not good, but you can see if you have a negative value here, it might be nice to give you kind of a dreamy sort of look, whereas going plus can make things seem a little bit crisper. Now, these settings are going to be different from image to image and also from subject to subject. So for example, with spring, I can go up to clarity value of say 30, 50 somewhere even, but with maybe I think it changes her colors too much, and so I actually prefer to keep her down somewhere in the 10 range. So it gives a little bit of an effect, but not overpowering. Vibrance and saturation are related. Saturation is going to make things, obviously more brightly saturated or less saturated, and go all the way down to 0. Vibrance is going to do it the same exact thing, except that it's going to take a look at the overall picture, and it's going to say, oh, well, this part here needs more saturation, but this part doesn't, or however it's going to look. And so you can see how we can go up pretty high before we start to get some really funny looking colors. Again, usually all on isn't the right answer, but you can see now where here where we're going back to where we started to where we finished, so you can kind of see how much difference we've made in such a short time. And of course, not talking about this would have made this edit all of about probably 20 seconds. So now I'm going to bring it over into Photoshop. I'm going to do one more adjustment. So I've set up some actions, and so these are things that I do over and over and over again. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the button so it automatically does that. So this is going to give it a little bit more contrast. It's going to make it seem just a little bit sharper, and then I'm going to go ahead and prepare it for the saving it on the Instagram. So this one here is going to make it smaller. It's going to allow me to do a little bit extra tweaking for the sharpness. So let's see what we got here. Turn that on, and I think we're pretty good. So hopefully you can see this is a pretty powerful tool, or set of tools. It definitely does work with JPEG, but you have much more flexibility with the RAW file. And to do even just the amount of adjustments that I've made here, where this is going to be able to make a beautiful print. Had I started with a JPEG, then I would start to see some image quality issues. So hopefully I get you a little bit convinced that the RAW format is the way to go, and hopefully I give you a little insight into how these programs can work to really develop your digital negative. Let me know if you have any questions.